Thank you to the board for this opportunity to provide clarity and realign some of the perceptions about code enforcement here in Arlington. Just in the way of groundwork, our primary purpose today is to provide an overview of code enforcement agencies here in the county and take a brief look into, as the manager provided to some degree so far, our legal authority, organization, our work protocols, some of the interagency relationships that make our agency work, and secondly, to open a discussion about recent concerns elevated by this body and some members of the community. After a brief background of the agency, organization, and operation, and staff will visit some of the specific work of the agency and clarify what, importantly, we do, what we don't do, challenges to the effectiveness of the program, some recent concerns, and conclude with a brief summary. A little bit about who we are. Something unusual for the day is I've got the code enforcement section here with me. I'm going to ask them to stand. It's actually very rare for them to all be in the same place at the same time. But I wanted to take the opportunity just so that you can just look at them one time. Thank you very much. You may be seated. I'm particularly proud of this group who oft work silently with little recognition or thanks. The work is complex. It's a hard job. And this, again, may be the very first time that many of you have ever seen them together. They're not going to show up on a website, on a poster, but they're working kind of silently in the background to get work done. A bit about the code enforcement section itself. As you can see from the diagram, we sit in the Inspection Services Division as part of CPHD, Community Planning and Housing Development Department. Zoning is another agency that is part of that agency, and we work very closely. Zoning has a separate enforcement unit that I'll talk about in a little bit of detail a little later on. The group that I just had stand has both an administrative or technical and a technical support staff. So the administrative staff would support the building of cases, the answering of phones, processing of documents, helping with court case, and the administration of an elevator program that has recently been added to the unit. The 8 inspectors actually report to 2 code enforcement supervisors that work in a technical team. A little bit of information here. All 14 of the inspectors have some form of certification. The inspections, the field inspectors, have an ICC certification. That's the International Code Council's certification as housing and property maintenance inspectors. They also are certified by the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development as building maintenance inspectors. That certification is maintained through the Virginia Building Code Academy, Jack Proctor Building Code Academy out of Richmond. They're all FEMA certified in disaster inspection specialties. And they are certified recently, since we adopted the noise control ordinance, in noise enforcement through Rutgers University. I'll provide more information about that as we go forward. 2 of our staff members are Department of Housing and Community Development state certified Code Academy instructors. It's actually rare, given the size of our unit, that 2 of the staff would actually be carrying that type of weight with them. And 50% of the staff are multilingual. They speak 8 languages, from Tagalog, Spanish, Sign Language, Portuguese, Vietnamese, Arabic, French, German, and Italian. That's helped us to be able to communicate effectively with our constituents, and actually to be able to be culturally sensitive. Important, considering how Arlington has grown and developed. We do a lot of work primarily with the zoning enforcement unit, and we work with a number of other agencies, including fire, police, the county attorney's office, which we meet with biweekly, the Commonwealth Attorney, Department of Human Services, as it would relate to the organizations or the help that we would need to provide to citizens that are in special need. Those relationships have helped us to be very effective at our work in the community. More to come. A little bit about our legal authority. On the left is a kind of a bar that shows the types of laws that might affect code enforcement activity. The red being federal laws, the constitutional requirements that we have to be sensitized to. First and Fourth Amendment are primarily concerns, the issues of free speech and the protection against unreasonable search come into play here. But any of the other federal standards that are highly restrictive are those that we're trained in, and we meet quite often to make sure that we don't breach any of those requirements. Above that are the state codes or laws that are put in place specifically for us, the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code and the Virginia Maintenance Code. I'll explain a little bit about that. And this authority is actually for us highlighted in orange. The Virginia Maintenance Code is a subsection of the statewide building code. Once a building receives a certificate of occupancy, the maintenance code is the code that is used to continue that legal and safe occupancy of the building. One of the most important activities we do in code enforcement is ensure that safe occupancies are continued. The local ordinances that may be adopted by this board, once empowered through Dillon Rule, involve these 5 ordinances that you see in orange here. The Condition of Private Property Ordinance, which is in part Chapter 10 of the Arlington County Code, deals with public nuisances like grass, trash, overgrowth, vehicles, other types of nuisances that would be addressed in the community. The Noise Control Ordinance, which was adopted in 2014, which we revamped in 2014 when it was initially adopted in the 70s. We spent quite a bit of time working through that ordinance, and there's some additional information we'll pass on about that as we move on. The Sidewalk Snow Removal Ordinance, which was adopted in 2010 following Snowmageddon. The Blight Ordinance, which deals with problem properties. It's a spot blighting tool to address spot blighting influences in the community, adopted in 2003. Building standards, which actually deal with the authority by which we do maintenance inspections. The state enables us to have a maintenance ordinance locally, and when the county adopted it, it was actually planted in the building maintenance standards, or in the building standards, which deals with a number of different things related to housing and housing-related enforcement. We, in 2007, realigned enforcement activities and separated the responsibilities for zoning enforcement out of the unit. If you think about the alignment of it, the zoning enforcement group, which is a very specialized group of inspection staff focusing on use, would actually report to the zoning administrator, and any appeals or actions for relief would actually go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, different than the building code or maintenance code violations that might be addressed by our staff, which would go to a local Board of Building Appeals and then to the State Virginia Technical Review Board for relief. So there is an appropriate alignment to pull out a number of inspectors and focus on the specialized work of zoning. And this has been something that has worked very well. They've been reporting to Arlo Vivon, the zoning administrator, on these specific issues you see now. The site-specific ordinances, such as those that come before the board relative to variances, use permits, and site plan conditions. There's a high level of interest in the community as those ordinances are grafted and drafted. And there's a lot of input by the community and concern about the enforcement of those issues. A little different than some of the weightier issues that might be coming from the state-adopted ordinances like the state-adopted codes like the maintenance code or the building code. The zoning ordinance is, again, another big ordinance that is given by state authority that would allow for the enforcement of those land use standards throughout the county.
We had one clarifying question.
Clarifying question. I'm just trying to understand the distinction between code enforcement and zoning enforcement. And you mentioned that zoning enforcement focuses on use. So is it right to, would that be roughly the correct breakdown, sort of use versus form, some challenge with the form of the building or?
Yeah, well, we would focus on, code enforcement would focus on the building, the structure,
okay,
and the land that's around it.
Got it.
Okay, that probably would clear it up. You're right.
Next slide is a whole explanation.
Let's see if this helps. I was on my way there. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Crystal.
Thank you.
Okay, just walking through, although we work closely, there are some differences, so let's look at what they are. Code enforcement focuses on structures and conditions of property. Zonings is land use concerns. The appeal that I just mentioned and how we appeal is mentioned in the next line. You can see that the code enforcement activities would focus on building safety, and the zoning activities would focus on some of the building uses or the restrictions that are associated with that. Information about how we differ: the average code enforcement case from the time we identify a violation to the average time we close it is about 47 days. As reported by zoning, the average closure on a case is 33 days. Notices are issued upon verification of a violation, okay? Verbal warnings are issued with zoning, and then those issues are documented. The criminal and then civil process is the path that we choose for code enforcement cases. State law would empower us to deal with these issues in a way of a criminal misdemeanor with some civil remedies that are in place, whereas zoning's focus is more civil that can turn to criminal. For example, if they issue civil infractions, when those numbers reach up to $5,000, then they're empowered to proceed as a criminal activity or as a criminal action in the court. The proofs are significant, and this is important, especially when constituents say, hey, I've got some pictures I'd like to give to you to build your case. Our proofs are beyond a reasonable doubt. So the rules of evidence apply very, very strongly in our case. We have to acquire the information. We must witness the violation. When it's complied, we must witness that it is complied and corrected. Whereas the zoning cases, because they're civil in nature, can work on the preponderance of the evidence, the weight of the evidence. Search warrants are required in both cases, which goes back to those federal standards and the protections that would be in place to make sure that there is no unreasonable searches that would take place. A little bit about our workload. There's been some misnomer that we're a bit of a complaint agency, and I wanted to illustrate some of the activity. This is just the enforcement workload for code enforcement, and we're showing the numbers, as you can see in the bar graph, from the years 2013 to 2016. And we average somewhere around 3,000 cases a year. But it's important to note, as you can see in this bar graph in the orange, that the complaints, which are highlighted, hover somewhere around 23% of our workload, around 600 cases a year. So where there have been some concerns in the community, it's needed to note here that mostly our cases are proactively acquired. And when I say proactively, that means that the work is either programmed or periodic. From an earlier slide, there was an elevator program that was in place, and one of the important issues with the elevator inspection program is that that work is periodic. As a pushpin, the work is, when you get in an elevator and you see a certificate in place, that certificate says that that equipment is safe to use. That cyclical inspection is periodic inspection. It's not generated by complaint. The surveys that we do of the community to make sure that the service that we're providing throughout the county is equitable is actually programmed. Again, it's not driven by a complaint. But to see the changes in the workload, anything that's in the blue bar is proactive, programmed, or periodic in nature. The complaints are listed below that. There's been some concern about unsafe properties in the community. We've heard a lot of information relative to that. And Chapter 36105C of the Code of Virginia empowers our staff to monitor existing buildings for compliance with code, under which it was approved and certified for occupancy. So there's been this misconception that there's a significant amount of unsafe properties in the county. However, a recent inventory by staff, with the exception of the 200-plus properties that are being sold or transferred that may be vacant for a period of time, show that there are about 81 unsafe properties. That will be at our hands, properties that have become vacated because of, let's say, hoarding conditions or because of some fire or some other instance that caused the building not to be in an occupiable state. Staff are managing those cases actively through. But 81 properties sounds like a lot until you begin to consider the number of developed parcels that we have here in the county at 63,000 and out of 66,000 total parcels. So out of the total parcels that we're dealing with, you're dealing with a very small amount of properties that we're managing through. And that's actually a very fluid amount because those properties will come online and fall online almost daily. A little bit about how we work. As you can imagine, if we're dealing with things like the building code and the maintenance code and standards that change, what's a little confusing to some is that the building code has a tendency to change, sometimes significantly in 3-year cycles. Our staff are involved in code enforcement development or in the code development. We'll go to hearings to make sure that whatever might be adopted either in an international settings or down in Richmond at the state level, technical amendments that the state may add, won't be something that we can't live with here in Arlington. The intensive service training that's required in codes is part of it's built into the schedule of work that staff have to do. They spend 5% of their work week in training, in service training and in team meetings, trying to improve the service and align our protocols so that we can ensure that what we're doing is a legal and an authorized and a fair and equitable process. Certainly as it relates to enforcement protocols, we're meeting with the Commonwealth attorney often on our cases and with the county attorney on a biweekly basis. Enforcement, importantly, is comprehensive. That means that when we go to a property, we're addressing the codes that are within our purview. It's not a myopic view. If we're going to look at something that's a very small, minor thing, and we see a bigger, major issue that needs to be addressed, we'll address it at the time so that a property owner receives a comprehensive list of things that need to be corrected. The importance of that is if we don't do it that way, and we have to go back to the property to address something significant, the property owner might feel that that's retaliatory or that's a piling on. So by addressing what we can see as completely as we can the very first time, that gives an opportunity for a property owner to plan out a plan of compliance, how they'd get there. It's a legal process, so we're bound by the due process of law that would make sure that we're following through, we're providing service. The notices are going to the correct parties. If it's a corporation, it's served the way a corporation should be served. If it's a trust, it's served the way a trust should be served. The notices typically go to the property owner with some exceptions. Staff are informative, respectful, equitable, and this is the part that some may not get right away, firm. Code enforcement has an element that deals with enforcement. No one likes the enforcement component, but it's required in order to pull people into compliance. Investigations, as I said earlier, are proactive, periodic, programmed, but in some cases they're triggered by complaints. And complainants, when contacting us, are asked to give information in detail. Well, the best way to reach out to us is by calling us at a number that's existed for over 40 years, 703-228-3232. If you grab an old phone book, you'll actually see it in there, even back when code enforcement was part of the county manager's office. But by calling us, you actually get a dynamic conversation. We don't reveal names. So if someone is concerned that by asking who you are, we're trying to get information, we're actually trying to make sure that if the inspector needs additional information to quickly close the case, they'll be able to reach out and touch and get that information so that compliance is timely. It's not been a case in the 16 years that I've been here ever where we have revealed names or where the court has ordered that names would need to be revealed. Enforcement, a separate action from notice, is actually triggered by failure to comply with a written notice that we send or issue to an owner. Our focus, again, is on safe occupancies. That's really important for us. A little bit quickly about the investigation process. Other than being triggered by a complaint, an investigation is research into the case. We're looking at the records to figure out what has happened at the property. We'll then go to the property and do an inspection, and we'll attempt to validate the conditions that we have found as a violation or not. We'll provide notice, written notice. It's always written notice from the code enforcement group. And in that notice, it gives you some information about the property, why we were there conducting an inspection, what rights you have as an owner or a recipient of a violation notice, and some of them are important, like the right to an extension. If you need more time and you can substantiate the need, there's a process by which you can submit that request to us, and we'll consider it. The need to have an appeal. If you feel like the code is being misapplied, it doesn't apply, I've read it, I've reviewed it, you have the right to have that heard by the appropriate board so that we are presenting our case and you're presenting your case so that that item can be decided. At the state level, it's the state building code, local building code board of appeals, excuse me, which leads to the technical review board, which then can lead to the circuit court. There's a path of action. Even if there's disagreement, there's a path of action. It's important to note that every notice has got that information and the time by which persons should apply or should file their appeal. We then wait for compliance. We give typically 30 days to comply. Again, you can sometimes get more if you can substantiate the need. And a reinspection is conducted to check to see if the conditions cited have been corrected. So again, to see the condition, to write the condition, we have to see, witness it. To comply it, we must see it, witness it. So it's important that property owners call us back so that we can actually see that the conditions are corrected. Otherwise, we couldn't possibly know. Out of that comes either compliance or enforcement. Enforcement is highlighted on the block below, and it includes three primary tools. One is court summons, which we use most often. On the criminal cases, on the cases that we can address as criminal misdemeanors, we'll then summons the property owner to court. And we're then working with the Commonwealth attorney in order to build the case. Take the case forward. There's a review by supervisors to make sure the service was appropriate. If there are any defects in the case at all, it went to the wrong person, name spelled wrong, we fix or cure those defects in the violation and go back to the point where there were no defects. Resetting, sitting everything out again new, giving additional time if it's necessary, giving additional notice if it's necessary to make sure that that due process is preserved. In some cases, we have the ability to cure the violation, and a local ordinance like the condition of private property ordinance gives us the ability to go back and cure the violation or to provide a civil infraction. One of the benefits of curing the violation is we'll correct it, the property owner will receive a bill from our administrative staff, and then after 15 days, that bill is then forwarded to a collections so that those issues can be collected and processed. All along the way, documents are issued by certified mail to make sure that it is either gone to someone or it's been signed by someone, or we can prove our attempts at service. Lastly, are civil infractions, which are given to us for things like the snow ordinance or the condition of private property ordinance, which allow us to provide a small fine. It's a warning, and then after 10 days, there's a $100 fine, and then after 10 days, there's a $150 fine for condition of private property. That leads to a $3,000 maximum. Important to note that the two cures that actually get to compliance are the court summons and the cure violation.
I was just saying the sun helps there, doesn't it? The weather.
It does. It does. A little bit about what we do. If there are two initiatives that are important, the Safe Occupancies Initiative and the Customer Service Initiatives are it. I just want to highlight a couple of different things. This information has gotten around in the community. Years ago, one of the things that would happen after, one of the issues that would happen after a fire is that a building might sit for a period of time before the conditions got corrected, I'm sorry. So what happens now is when the fire department takes control of a building during exigent events, the building, if it's an existing structure, is turned over to inspection services, code enforcement often if it's an existing structure. And we're communicating with the building owner about what would be needed to get that building back online. And that's been something that has reduced the number of complaints that have come into our office about vacant buildings that have been sitting in the community for some period of time. And there's a misnomer that we're going out to properties and we're just putting people in violation right after they had a fire, which isn't true at all. What we're doing is we're making sure that they understand what the path to correction is. We can expedite some things so that they can get online quicker. But what we found is that when you're dealing with an insurance company right after you've had a fire, it can be a bit overwhelming. So by giving someone a notice that says that the structure that you live in has some corrections that need to be made that are so serious that you can't live in the building, then that notice can be used to help arouse or to direct someone to immediate housing. It has helped the insurance agencies to be able to understand the seriousness of it. Some corporate office out of state all of a sudden says that there's an unsafe condition that's occurring at one of their insured's home. We are willing to have dialogue with the permission of the homeowner to get those buildings online. And working with the chief building official, that's been something that's been very effective in the community. The thank yous are kind of quiet. You know, I think sometimes there's a concern when people will see it's in the community and they think that, well, code enforcement is going to place me in violation. Well, no, it's not that. What we're trying to do is get you back online. We want to make sure that you're safe living in the building. The largest growing or largest trending work that we have right now, actually regionally, the largest amount of work in this industry related to code enforcement, it's unpermitted construction and illegal conversions of use. It's, you know, it's epidemic right now, specifically in this area. Great schools, a wonderful place to live, low crime, people want to be here. So what we've seen is an increase in conversions of attics and garages and spaces and offices into spaces that might be used for other purposes by which they're not approved. The sad effect is that if there's a fire in those buildings, then often there can be an injury, significant, or loss of life because they're not approved to be used that way. The construction methods are not designed, that they've used, are not designed to protect the fire from spreading quickly. So we've been dealing with that. We've worked with a number of other counties here. I'm a member of a Northern Virginia code officials consortium, and we meet actually in 2 weeks in Loudoun County to discuss the impact of this. Other cities that have home rule are using different tools to try and get to finding people that they catch doing this work in a significant way. New York City, for example, what we've been doing is we've been working to try and make sure that we get a homeowner that might have inadvertently done something. I did it. I didn't think it was an issue where I lived before. I want to get online. I'll help you to get it to move the property to a compliant property if we can. And if not, we'll then be able to explain the reasons why. Hoarding Task Force. And it's interesting as we talk about numbers. Arlington County since 2003 has done 487 hoarding cases. 487, from severe, which is you can't move through the building, to some that may be moderate. We don't really deal, it's not a housekeeping issue at all. The minor, someone has a room that's filled with storage, is probably not what we see more often. You can't look at a building and tell from the outside the impact of someone that may be living. It's much worse than you see on television. And people are surprised when we bump into the circumstances in a community such as ours. But the ratio for hoarding cases, just nationally, is 390 for every 100,000 population. If we just use that stat, you can imagine we're over 700 cases that are hidden throughout the community. People that may be colleagues and friends of yours that you're not aware of, and they're living in horrific conditions. They can't get to the window, they can't get to the door. We've had people climbing through back doors to get in, climbing through windows. The accumulation is so extensive that it's just inches below a ceiling fan. It can fall on them. The greatest danger is to our first responders that are going in to get them. There's an accumulation or an excessive amount of storage that builds the flame load or the fire load within the unit, and then it makes it so that it's completely unsafe should they go in, and materials that are combustible can potentially light and fall. As an aside, I can remember a case that occurred recently where there's so much accumulation that as we were cleaning it, working with the property owner to clean the property, an extension cord was moved because they can't get to the receptacles. So what they do is they run extension cords through the flammable material and then plug it in. And we can see how the extension cord had scorched against the wall. It was an accident waiting to happen. Our timing was critical. We worked very closely with the fire department, with the Arlington County Police Department, with Human Services. There's a high level of recurrence in these cases. It's very, very complex, but we've been doing very well at this. As it relates briefly to our customer service initiatives, I focus on our service and compliance expectations that we share. When you file a case with code enforcement, certainly by calling us, what you're going to get at the end of that call is a case number, and you're going to get an expectation as to when staff will get there, service expectation, and if we find a violation, what the compliance expectation would be. We've already talked about extensions of compliance and appeals, but also we have our Clean and Lean initiative that I touched on earlier. It's again part of the self-help that we would be able to do under the local condition of private property ordinance. As much as we do some work, there are some things that we don't do. We don't handle tenant-landlord issues. We have a separate division for that. Waste and pickup issues, it's not quite us. The live entertainment and dance hall permits, zoning handles those issues. Water on sidewalks, there's a number of issues. And it's important to note here that 50% of the people that call us are calling with a non-related code enforcement call. It's not related, not sure if this is the right place, but. And so what we've got is somebody that, I'll just start with you. The other interesting stat that I'd like to share with you is that 1/3 of those callers that we receive, calls, documents, emails, faxes, are someone who's already angry. And it's challenging because we have to try and walk them down so that we can triage, we can hear the issues. Importantly, when we finally get down to the issues, we're discovering that the reason why they're probably angry is because they've put off the call, waiting for the person or persons or businesses that were doing something that they did not feel was effective to kind of move on and correct it themselves. Let's see if we can move on a little bit. Some of the challenges to our work, and the biggest challenge is people that wish to bypass the process. Okay, code enforcement is a process. So there's a notice portion, there's certainly an investigation, there's a notice portion, there's a compliance process, there's a reinspection process, there's an enforcement process that can come out of that reinspection. And no one likes the enforcement process. We've seen spikes over the years with retaliatory complaints. Back in the 2000s, early 2000s, they were fairly high. I don't like my neighbors, so what I do is I call the building police, the property police, and I cite conditions and I push really hard to make sure that you deal with them. I want to know what's going on at the property. The opposite side of that is that things have quieted down over time. Our response in training to staff is start to talk about issues of mediation. If you're not getting along with your neighbor, there are tools. Community mediation is very effective. And it's not court. You don't have to go to court to resolve it. But if the issue is that something that needs to be addressed by us, we're certainly going to address that. Anonymous complaints, persons that are at glass houses throwing rocks, and sometimes they're giving us inappropriate addresses. Just drive out to the community and you'll see what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, if you're anonymous, we may not know that it's you that have a greater violation than the person you're calling about. That's happened. That's an unintended consequence. So we like to get information about who's calling, and the benefit of that is if the inspectors need additional information, for example, an overcrowding case. Someone believes that there are too many people living in the house. Overcrowding actually under the zoning definition would be over-occupancy, maybe too many unrelated people living in the house. What's helpful is if those calls come in, and they often do come into code enforcement, we're able to get the information, build the case, and then send it to the zoning enforcement group so that they've got good sound information to do their investigation. If they just knock on the door and say, hey, are you overcrowding over here? Somebody that might be doing it would just go underground. So the more information we're able to get in a dynamic way, in a conversation, the more effective we can be in our enforcement, the quicker that timeline to compliance will occur if there's indeed a violation. It's actually very rare for someone to be able to have too many people in a building based on the square footage of the home, which is what we deal with under the building code. Big issue here is aggressive citizens, case filings that are based in racism, bigotry, or standing. The calls are sometimes very direct. We have to deal with all citizens. That's anyone who will call us at any time with any issue. And depending on their level of anger or concern, sometimes they're very direct about what their position is. I don't have to go deep into the details of what you can probably imagine in your mind, but people will speak very, very directly and then say what they don't like about that group, those people, that business, whatever the case is, and they're bordering right on the line, actually easily defined. There's a definition of discrimination, racism, and what we're trying to do is make sure that our staff focus on the building and focus on the issues around the land. And we'll communicate that. And we'll communicate that expectation. Sometimes even after a complete investigation, if we find that there is no violation, there's an additional agenda. I want to know why there was no violation. Well, what about, and the list gets longer. And what about, and the list gets even longer. So we can sometimes work those persons that are driving those issues down. But sometimes those issues bubble up to your level in the form of a complaint about arbitrary enforcement or our ability not to bring something to closure. I've already spoken about the non-related calls that have come into the agency and those that might be contentious to us. Let's see if I can get to the concerns here. So some of the chief concerns that have been reported to us relate to hoarding or unsafe properties, derelict properties that are in the community. There's been a concern about nighttime noise enforcement and how we deal with it. And then cyclical property concerns that are often brought about with seasonal issues that come across. So if the question is, what is a derelict property? And we wanted to define it a little bit and then talk about some of the concerns. So the concerns are properties that are unsafe, that are declared unfit by the maintenance code definitions, buildings that might be vacant, again, excluding those 200 so properties that are in transfer each week, or properties that have stalled compliance. It doesn't seem like the case is moving. Again, if I point out that our compliance on average is 47 days, some are almost complied immediately. Others have taken 4 years to comply. But on average, 47 days is pretty good. Concerns, the timeline is long. It takes a long time to get code enforcement to move forward. If you remember that a third of the people that are contacting us are already angry, and in some cases it's because they waited a long time to call. So we're adding that to the perception in their mind. And when you call us, it's the first time we heard. So it's important for us to tell what that timeline is going to be. That's why the service expectations are so important. There's been a concern about additional laws. Do we need additional laws to be effective at code enforcement? But a real challenge has been complex ownerships, unprobated estates, parents that have died, or trusts that seem to have fizzled. And we try and work through those lines to see if we can get the correct property so that we can do the enforcement that's listed here. Court enforcement is the tool that has worked for us. Go backwards for a moment. In 2003, when we adopted the spot blight ordinance, the key is that we had 117 properties that were on a blight list, and Mr. Fizette may remember it, and the community forwarded those properties to us, and staff added to that list. 3 properties came to the board. 114 properties were cured with old-fashioned court enforcement. We take the property owners to court and enforce the minimum standards, which help them to bring those buildings back into compliance. What's completely legal is what you see is the center picture here. It's a building that's boarded up. A property owner, the Commonwealth is a huge property rights state, and you can literally board up a building as long as the conditions on the outside meet compliance. And What we had done is to work to make sure that that type of influence, negative influence in the community is really minimized. We try and steer property owners to putting the building back into use. It takes a lot of skill to do that. We want to get the building back online. You can transfer it. Have you considered selling the building? Have you considered putting family members into it? There are places where you can go if you don't believe that you can afford to make the repairs. And we use compliance coaching to help people to get there. The blight ordinance, we've spoken about a little briefly. The blight ordinance has 9 conditions that can be activated to go forward. What will happen is that those properties will receive a blight, preliminary blight designation for me, and it would have to meet one of 9 sets of conditions. And then the property owner, should they fail to cure the blight, that would come forward to the Planning Commission and then to this board, where you can make a decision to cure the blight, take care of the issue, which may be to take care of some problem that's creating it, or take the building down, or to acquire the property. It's a lengthy process. It's an expensive process. It works very much like eminent domain. It can take as much as a year to pull all the way through. When I say expensive, to take a simple property like the one down, based on figures that we've received, would be about $70,000. So if we've got 81 properties that we're attempting to deal with, you could see what the math would be like if we decided to go forward with that. Nighttime noise. Andy Penn is here from, Deputy Chief Andy Penn is here to answer some questions in depth about noise concerns. I did want to say what the issue is that happens at noise. There's confusion about who to call, and we've worked through that when we worked through the 5-year-long process for the noise ordinance. The other is managing citizen expectations. It's about a 2009 Virginia Supreme Court decision to remove subjectivity. Well, we were very effective at removing it from the ordinance, not so much from the minds of citizens. You know, too loud is still too loud to me. Wrong music is still the wrong music. Turn it down. The biggest problems that are reported to us are construction activity at night and barking dogs. But that's not the biggest activity that's reported to the Arlington County, noise-related activity that's reported to the Arlington County Police, as you can probably imagine. Probably stems around the issues or activities of parties and revelers, music that's too loud, fighting, public drunkenness. Those have been the activities, and I'll let Deputy Chief Penn go into detail when we get to discussion. Importantly, we've spoken about coordinating between our agencies and the protocols that we put in place. So we have an enterprise-wide database system that we're attempting to adopt and put in place here that would allow us to communicate a warning that occurs during the day with an enforcement action that might occur at night. So one of the challenges is with the noise ordinance, there's a requirement to warn first. So you can imagine when the police show up in their uniform, with their officialness, a warning from them usually kind of quells whatever the sound issue is. There may be a high level of criminality that's going on that they're going to address, but what it's going to do is kind of put a lid on the noise. With us, sometimes there are some levels of recurrence. The pre-construction meetings will take care of some of the issues around construction activities. Mostly what we're getting are calls around the big projects, not something, and there's a misnomer that you can't do construction activity, and it's the noise ordinance is the reason why. It's not true. The noise ordinance does not regulate construction activity. The noise ordinance regulates noise. So a site plan or use permit condition may restrict a property owner from staging or from doing certain types of activity, even if the noise ordinance would allow you to create noise for that type of activity as you're building. That goes back to the site-specific ordinances that zoning has purview that you adopt as a board here. There's something new that we've looked at, and after discussion with the chief building official, he has the ability to issue a stop work order for violations of pertinent laws, such as the noise control ordinance. So if we place someone, either the police or if code enforcement places some property owner in violation because of construction-related noise that's being produced, that information to him could produce a stop work order for them to stop work, which is significant, until they're able to comply with the noise ordinance.
Good lever.
See if I can move on here.
That's a good one.
And cyclical property issues. This is often built around the issues of, this is where we hear mostly the concerns of arbitrary enforcement. These are standards that actually are International Property Maintenance Code, which is part of the International Code Council, puts the same standards in place that we have here. And we've heard about arbitrary enforcement. We've heard about inadequate enforcement, the other side of the spectrum. There's been some challenges about county methods that we use to correct violations, and what they're talking about is the cure. And we do a small amount. It actually wound up in the budget. We're dealing with 15, 16, 18 cases on average a year. County enforcement of encroaching or overgrown vegetation on, and this is something that's been specified to you, butterfly gardens and certified wildlife habitats. What we've seen, even when we respond to these issues, is 6 feet of vegetation that prohibits anyone from the street to see the structure. What we've seen and what we've received is complaints about vermin, vector-related issues, biting insects, ticks in the community, and that's what the vegetation limitations are designed to cure. This is not at all about cultivated gardens, but this is about letting things grow wild and out of control. This is a very, very dense community. There are expectations in the community that people are expected to adhere to. Education is the most important piece. So we try and explain the reasons why. And we've actually put that information on our Building Arlington website. We want people to go there and visit it, see and hear why those conditions are in place. But they're not unusual for Arlington. And this is part of enabling legislation that was put in place in the 80s and have been adopted by most counties, larger counties initially, then expanded by the state to be something that can be of performance in all counties. There's also been an assessment excuse me, of unused personal items that are stored outside as trash and debris. The condition of private property ordinance kind of gives us some path to say when the personal items could become a harborage or potential issue that would affect the safety of others. Again, tires and things that are stored on the outside, containers, wood that might be contributing to pests that might be invading other properties. So the cyclical property concerns are vegetation overgrowth and items that are openly stored. The way we deal with it are through civil infractions, which could be the fines that I pointed out earlier. Warning, 10 days, $100, 10 days, $150, excuse me, or self-help protocol, which is to cure the violation and give the property owner that cost. And in closing, safe occupancies are our primary focus, importantly. Proactive, periodic, or programmed work is how we are driven. Our inspections are comprehensive. They're a legal process. And because they're a legal process, they're triggered when there is failure to comply with a written notice, always that. The staff training is extensive. In order to be able to do this effectively, there are very few cases where we have had to withdraw a violation notice because of a defect. But we are willing to withdraw a violation notice if it is defective, because we wouldn't be able to prosecute it or to take it to an appeal. If we know that it's wrong, we're going to fix it and pull it back. Importantly, staff are informative, education is key, respectful, equitable, and firm. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address some of the concerns that you have, and I'm certainly here with Arlo Vavon and Shari Amiri and Andy Penn and the manager to answer any questions.